Yeah, all right. Let's talk to Micheal here, who wants to talk about the historicity of the resurrection. Micheal, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Great.
You've been on hold for quite a while. I just want to say thank you so much for your patience. I'm sorry we couldn't get to you sooner. Go ahead and open up your topic
No
for
worries at
us.
all. Um, okay, sure. Just disclaimer. I did listen to all of your guys' previous calls on the show, and I know you guys probably know this, but just to put it out there, not all Christians think the same way.
Oh, I know
I'm
that.
not necessarily in agreement with everything that the other guy said.
Okay. No, I appreciate you making the disclaimer. We're going to assess you as you come to us. I will not leverage any judgment on previous callers on you as well.
I can empathize because I was
I,
I was a Christian who would often remind people of that too. Like,
Me
we're
too.
not all the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, on that vein of thought, actually, I am a recent-ish Christian. I used to be an atheist for 1.5 to 2 years, and the evidence that I intend to present this evening is part of at least what convinced me that Christianity is true. Also for further context, but yeah, I think the resurrection is historical. I don't necessarily subscribe to mainstream Christian apologetics on this point. I found the concept of undesigned coincidences as popularized by William Paley centuries ago. Actually,
Could you speak up
really
just a
convincing.
tad,
If I can't
Michael?
for either of
Sorry.
you- Oh, I'm sorry. Were you able to hear what I said, or should I?
I'm
repeat?
hearing you. It's just kind of hard to hear you, which I'm guessing
Yeah.
the audience can't hear you very well either then.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just speak up just
I don't know what.
Yeah, if you can just speak a little louder, or maybe position whatever microphone you're using on your phone, just maybe move it a little closer to your mouth. It's not bad. It's just a little quiet.
Okay, I'll try and speak up a bit then. I'm actually close
Okay.
to get as of now.
Okay.
So yeah, as I was saying, I find the evidence, it's called undesigned coincidences. It was popularized by William Paley, actually a few centuries ago. And by chance, are either of you familiar with the concept of undesigned coincidences?
I'm not.
no.
Okay. So as far as I understand it, like if a police officer was interrogating two different witnesses, he would normally isolate them and then ask them questions and then review the testimony that they produced at a later time and compare them. And as far as I'm aware, if certain details that are rather casually inserted into the testimony tend to confirm or disconfirm the testimony of the other witness when they were isolated, then that should increase the confidence of the officer that the testimony that was produced was accurate, or decrease depending on whether or not the testimony confirms or disconfirms. I believe details like this can be found between the gospel accounts and also from the gospel accounts and external secular sources that would have been produced at the time. I'm prepared to give a couple examples, but I suppose if you have any questions about that right there, we can discuss that.
Well, my immediate response is that the gospels conflict with each other. So I already feel like we have a problem there because the gospels don't all have the same story. There's differences between them.
Okay. The first thing I would say is that I guess it would depend upon the nature of the distinction, because I believe it was legal scholar Thomas Starkey who said that the usual character of human testimony is substantial truth with circumstantial variety. So I think we should expect some differences, just because if it is eyewitness testimony, that's kind of how my understanding of it works. But I suppose if you have rather drastic contradictions, then that might perhaps cause me to revise my assessment. Could you provide an example or two?
Okay, so the nature of the places, the first thing that comes to mind is like Jesus carrying his own cross. I believe like every single gospel has a different account of who carried the cross. Not that detail in itself changes the gospel, right? Because if you're looking at the core meaning that the Christian is going to take away, it's that Jesus died for their sins. And so maybe who carried the cross is not important information to them. But if we're talking about an inerrant word of God and all-powerful God and all-knowing God who's okay, but if we're talking about, are we talking about an all-powerful, all-knowing God who's able to communicate with his creation?
I believe so, yes.
So if we're looking at the extraordinary power of that claim, conflicting gospels kind of conflict with that claim, because if we're talking about a God that could create all the cells in my body and all the complexity in the hemoglobin of my blood, just look up the hemoglobin of your blood and how complex it is. Why would it be that he could go into such detail in creating me, but when he's giving accounts of the thing that's supposed to save me, the thing that I'm supposed to believe in, there's conflicting stories?
So I would bracket theological pre-commitments when looking at these texts. I prefer to view them as historical documents like any other that would have been produced and see how they match up. So I'm not coming at this assuming that it has to be true. I'm just looking at the evidence that I would look at for any other source and seeing how it would compare, is my take.
Right, and you said you were an atheist, so you weren't assuming it was true, and then you were convinced that it's true through this process. So continue to elaborate on what you called in about. Remind me of the term again. You said
undesigned coincidences.
Thank you very much. Undesigned coincidences. So something about this convinced you that Christianity was true.
Yes, unfortunately. Present everything, because I know you guys are going to want to move on, but this is a part of it, sure. So I can give an example then. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the story in the Gospels about feeding of the 5,000. The specific passage that I'm looking at is in John chapter 6. So they're looking at the crowds, and Jesus turns to Philip, who is one of his followers, and he asks him, okay, so where are we going to buy bread? And obviously it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek question, because they're in front of 5,000 people, so it's not like they're actually going to be able to come up with that amount of bread. And an additional notation there is that Philip doesn't really feature very much in the Gospels. Like, most people know about Peter and Paul, but Philip isn't exactly a main character. So if this was going to be inserted for the purpose of convincing people like me thousands of years later, you probably wouldn't use Philip. He's not a big character. But an additional detail, 6 chapters later in a different context, we learned that Philip is from Bethsaida. Totally different situation. And so that adds an additional detail to the story. But the question remains why it is Philip is asked the question. And I think that question is answered of why Philip would have been asked in the Gospel according to Luke. And we learn that there, the situation, the whole episode happened, Luke chapter 9. The feeding of the 5,000, it says, was in Bethsaida. So I think this is an example where it clarifies why Philip would have been asked, because he would know where the food is. Kind of like, asking the natives in any city where to go, what the attractions are. So I think this is an example where seemingly casual details in different Gospels interlock in surprising ways that seem at least to increase the credibility of the account.
Okay, but have you ever looked at the examples of where the Gospels conflict? Because you're looking at things that make sense, right? You're finding information that you're like, if this were true, this would totally make sense and line up when we're talking about the accounts from the Gospels. But then what about all the places where the Gospels conflict with each other?
Yeah, so I think you ought to weigh the best evidence for the historicity against the best evidence for the ahistoricity. And so I was giving you examples of what convinced me, not what didn't convince me. We can look at the details that would seem to conflict, certainly. Like I said before, I think a few of those are to be expected, because I think that's the character of human testimony, is that you're going to find variation on what people report. But I was giving positive evidence. But we can look at the
right.
too.
No, you're right. I asked you what
I'm open to that.
That's fair. I guess in what you said about the historicity, the historical evidence outweighing the ahistorical evidence, it wouldn't be ahistorical, it'd be like contradictory information. No, because it's a historical document. It's just conflicting with other historical documents in the Bible. It wouldn't be ahistorical. It'd just be like anecdotal evidence that doesn't exactly perfectly line up with other anecdotes, right? Like one gospel's an anecdote and you have another one.
When I read the skeptical literature, they use the term ahistorical, which is why I do, but I'm not going to get hung up on the labels. We can call it whatever we want, so long as we understand each other.
Okay, yeah, I guess I was misunderstanding it as like Okay, yeah, I guess I was misunderstanding. So I am just catching up on this whole
It doesn't matter.
concept. So, okay.
Can I ask you a question real quick, Michael?
Yeah, yeah.
Are you familiar with when the Gospels were written?
Yes. Well, I know there are differing views, and I think that the mainstream view for, Mark was written first, which I agree with. Most people would say that's written 70 AD, and then you have Matthew and Luke, which are in the 80s or 90s, and then John, which is like 95, come at the turn of the century type thing. I think that's consensus.
Okay, and how old did people usually live back then?
Oh boy. I know there were a lot of wars, so that could have reduced less than. I actually don't have the number off the top of my head.
I mean, not that old. I don't have a number off the top of my head either. I was just curious if you knew. Yeah, there's a lot of speculation as to whether or not the people who composed these Gospels are actually identified by the names that the Gospels bear. And there's also speculation as to the sources. Just doing some light Googling, because this is stuff that I always want to learn more about, and I've heard of the Q source before, but there's a source called Q or Kel or Quell. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but it's basically something. Yeah. Okay. So you're familiar with this concept. So if these documents are all drawing from one another, if any one of them is false, wouldn't they not all by drawing from each other? Like, do you get what we're getting at? If there are inconsistencies and they all draw from each other, how do we know that it's not a multiplicative, effect essentially?
Okay, so the thing about Q is that it's only in relation to the Synoptic Gospels, which are Mark, Matthew, and Luke. The thing is that there is information that Matthew and Luke both have in common from Mark. And then there's information that Matthew and Luke both have in common that you can't find in Mark. And so Q is postulated to explain the differences, the similarities between Matthew and Luke that you don't find in Mark. That's Q.
Right, really, but if Luke and Mark were there, why would they need these other sources? Or not Luke and Mark, Luke and Matthew, I believe. The later ones.
Yeah, well, we're kind of getting sidetracked a little, but I mean, I'm not necessarily saying they had, so there would be information that they would have known about personally, and then there would have been information that they might not have been specifically party to, in which case it makes sense they would use sources that they had.
How big do you think these Gospels were? Like, how far and wide do you think they were published when they were written? Do you think that the Gospel authors just like mailed them to each other, or they all lived in the same city, or how do you envision that going down? I guess.
I think there was a certain amount of oral tradition in between the events depicted and the actual authorship of the Gospels. I am not familiar enough with the geography and the historical significance of that to be able to give a detailed answer.
Okay, no, and that's fine. That's an acceptable answer. I mean, like I said, I can't go on about that either. I'm just curious if you know, because you're the one who's claiming that these are that these are historically accurate, and I again, it's one of those things, and I don't want to be too reductionist here, but I've always heard it explained that New York City appears in the Spider-Man comic, but that doesn't tell us that Spider-Man is real. That tells us that New York City is real, and that the person who wrote Spider-Man likes New York City. Same thing with the Bible. Israel is real. That doesn't mean the Bible's real. And I know you're being more nuanced about it than that. I'm not trying to be too reductionist here, but just to kind of recap, if there are both true and not true things in it, then I think that entire source should be suspect, not just the parts that we find to be consistent inside of the source.
So what I would say is that I would take an inductive, cumulative approach to the sources. I think that, if we could look at the areas that we can check them on in history, and if they seem to be getting those right, then that ought to mean something for the areas that we can't necessarily check them on, because we can't check them on everything 2,000 years ago.
Right. Well, we can't check them on anything, actually.
And how would you determine that?
Well, you said we can't check them on everything because it was 2,000 years ago, and I'm saying we can't actually verify any primary source at this point. It's too sands of time have washed it away. I mean, we have primary writings from the era, but we don't have primary sources of the Bible, is what I'm saying. We only have reproductions.
Don't remain. When I was saying checking, I meant like how you would check anything else, like any other ancient source. I wasn't necessarily saying you go back to the time machine as well.
Oh, okay. No. Okay, I got you.
Yeah. So I think if we can look at the instances in which we can check, verify, and by that I mean how we would check, verify any other ancient source. If we can develop a cumulative case, and that I think ought to mean something for the areas in which the gospel accounts cannot be verified because we are 2,000 years removed and we don't have all the sources that they would have had. And so I think looking at instances like the ones that I gave you, a Roman historian named Hamner did a study on Acts of the Apostles, and he wrote a book called, I believe it's the Acts of the Apostles in the setting of Hellenistic history, I believe. And he found 84 instances of historical confirmation in the last half of the book of Acts. So I guess the cumulative case seems to be quite strong. I guess I would need to know what you guys are referring to when you say areas where they got things wrong, if we're going to weigh that against all these areas that it seems like they got things right on.
Sure. I can email you some examples. I don't have any off the top of my head right now, but there are like conflicting accounts within the Gospels. And I think you said they might have been, Martin, you said they might have been anonymous. They definitely were anonymously written.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think I said they might have. Oh, you're talking to him.
No, I might have.
But I don't make any claim to authorship. My argument doesn't depend on Mark actually writing Mark. Whoever it is, I think they knew what they were doing.
So so that person has to be a disciple of Christ, though, for it to be right, because Mark was a disciple, or apostle? Excuse me. Sorry, I was using the wrong word.
Yeah, because it wouldn't be eyewitness.
It's necessary for them to be a disciple. Mark was definitely not an eyewitness.
What?
For sure.
Okay.
Neither Mark nor Luke was.
Okay, so why you just think they were inspired by God to write accurately?
Yeah, like I said, I kind of bracket the theology. I'm just looking at this from the historical component. And I think their writing, if you compare that to that of other authors, historians of the time, I think it compares remarkably well, and I think it can be cross-checked. And I think the result of that checking ought to increase one's confidence that what's being written is in fact what happened.
Okay. All right, Martin, are you looking up conflicting accounts within the Gospels, or should I?
No, because I don't want to necessarily do that. I'm just doing a little bit of light reading about the Gospel of Mark because that's one of the ones that I'm more familiar with. Wrapping back to the historicity of the resurrection. The thing that I want to see is that a human can revive from being dead, like a human body, and that like people can walk on water and stuff like that. Like we're talking about the internal consistency of the Bible. I want to see the external consistency with reality.
Sure. So is your attack then going to be philosophical in nature about the validity of miracles? Is this what you're saying?
Well, it's not so much an attack. It's just a place of doubt. Like I don't think that that's something that's capable of happening. And if it is something that can happen, then why is God so reserved with his power? I guess.
Okay. The way I like to look at these sorts of things is to at least leave the possibility of miracles on the table. To say, look, maybe not always it's the most probable explanation, but I think it should be at least possibly true. And that leaves the door open for evidence to be compared for and against the miracles. And if the evidence seems to point in that direction, then I think it is rational to follow that evidence and to tentatively conclude that, yes, a miracle did happen. And if the converse is the case, then I think one ought to revise their assessment in light of that direction as well.
Does your assessment include a presupposition that God both exists and is capable of miracles? Because that's a lot to assume at the start of an assessment.
That's not how I didn't. So there's different forms of apologists. there's classical apologetics, which is kind of where you're going. They work for God's existence first, and then they say, let's look at the resurrection. That's not how I did it. I just looked at the evidence for the resurrection and concluded it was good enough. So I'm not assuming that.
Okay, well, it's not good enough for me. I can tell you that much. And I am a former Christian. I have, given my testimony and all that before, and claimed that I believed it because I did at the time. And that's the thing, is however many people believe something doesn't make it any more true. I think we're kind of getting close to wrapping here. Right? No, I know, but I'm explaining why I believed at the time. And why I no longer do.
Sure.
Autumn, do you have anything else you wanna say before we wrap here? I think we're kind of getting overtime.
Yeah, nothing that I can do too briefly because I have like a few responses I've been brewing, but not if we're wrapping up the show.
We don't have to wrap. I just don't have much else to say at this point.
Yeah, I guess it's just like, and I would have to see more of this evidence that he's talking about, and it would be like a longer conversation for me to say for certain. But like, what stops you from being like, they were really accurate, good storytellers? Because like you're saying, what they're saying makes sense for who lived in the city at the time. Was it Philip? Can you say that part again?
Yeah, Philip with Bethsaida with feeding of the 5,000. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Can you repeat that part for me?
Sure, yeah. Sure. Okay, yeah. So John chapter 6 starts out. They're in front of the crowd. Jesus asks Philip where to buy the bread. That's odd. Philip's not a big character. 6 chapters later, we learn that Philip is from Bethsaida. That's an additional detail. Then Luke chapter 9, it says that the episode with the feeding the 5,000 is in Bethsaida, which explains why Jesus would have asked Philip, but that's a different source. Seemingly casually interlocking details, I think, ought to increase one's confidence that this actually happened.
Okay.
None of that.
Yeah, see, and that. Well, hold on.
Sorry,
I think. Yeah, you said it was my turn.
Sorry.
See, that seems like it could be like good storytelling, right? Because like not to say that J.K. Rowling's a good person, but when she writes Harry Potter, she has like these crazy storylines that all like tie in together, and it makes sense later on in the story, little details that you missed before. And every time you read the Harry Potter series, there's little things that you find like that add up, right? So what makes you say this is evidence for Christianity being true rather than earlier man being good storytellers? Because also, like I said, if you look up, the one example that comes to mind, and I'm sorry that I don't have more, I'm going to get better at thinking off the top of my head, but if you look up who carried Jesus's cross, the details are different in every gospel, and that seems no less important than this detail about Philip to me. And you're saying that outweighs the contradictions, like the things that make sense outweigh the contradictions, but I don't see it that way so far, and I'm trying to be fair to you. So this is obviously a call-in show. We have a short amount of time, and I'm sure you've looked a lot into this. So in order to be fair, maybe we can talk more on Discord or another time. But to me, it's like that seems. Do you get what I'm getting at here?
Yeah, you're basically saying that I'm doing a heads I win, tails you lose kind of thing.
Well, you're looking at the things now. This would be confirmation bias, not that that's kind of like the atheist go-to. So I hate to use it, but like you're looking at the things that confirm Christianity to be true, like the story about Philip, and you're saying that that's historical and that makes sense, and it does, especially if you're looking for hope and some God that loves you. But then on the other end of things, please look up contradictions between the Gospels. Look up who carried Jesus's cross, and see if that information is just as conflicting as the information about Philip is compelling, because I think that there are just as many conflicting things as compelling things in the Bible. And you could say I'm biased because I'm an atheist, right? I think that would be fair, right? But at the same time, there was a point where I wasn't biased. I was a Christian who wanted Christianity to be true. I very much did. And there was so much evidence against Christianity being true that I absolutely could not believe it. It wasn't even a choice. I woke up one day and I just didn't anymore, and it sucked. But I would say that I had a bias for wanting Christianity to be true, and I still couldn't prove it to be true to myself. So,
Okay.
in fairness here.
Couple things.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really talked about my transition experience because I don't see it as relevant to the evidence, but I didn't, as an atheist, and surprisingly enough, still don't actually want Christianity to be true. I don't prefer this version of reality. Not saying I'm not biased, but I'm not.
Why not?
You mentioned before that I might wanting to be looking. Okay, so you're familiar with divine hiddenness, the argument from Divine by J.L. Schellenberg and whatnot?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a cultural expectation built up between Christians that when you convert, you're supposed to have this internal vertical experience. You're supposed to hear something or sense something or something. I used to be a Christian before, and I was an atheist, came back to be a Christian. I haven't received anything that I can tell to be communication from God, which has caused me no amount of I don't know what word to use, but I don't prefer the type of God to exist that I would expect to communicate with me, but never seems to. So I don't actually like this version of Christianity that I happen to think is correct.
Okay.
I do think I have biases. I'm not saying I don't, but
Yeah, a couple of questions. Sorry to cut you off. A couple of questions.
Yeah.
What do you mean by atheist? Define atheist for me, and then why were you an atheist?
Okay. I understand there to be two different definitions of atheism that are.
Give the definition of atheist that you were. I don't want to hear I've heard all the different definitions. I want to hear the kind of atheist that you were and why you were an atheist.
Okay. So I started off with I'm not convinced, and that was because I realized as a Christian there were a lot of things I was taking for granted that I couldn't answer. And I thought the rational response to that was to suspend belief until I had come up with more information and then reevaluate at that time. So I started off as the I'm not convinced type, and I moved to the I'm convinced to the contrary, more the classical I am convinced this is not the case at a later time. So I did both.
Convinced against Christianity or all gods?
All gods, theism.
Okay. And then why? Oh, you said why? Because you didn't find Christianity compelling, but you also just didn't find any evidence for there being any other deities, if I'm gathering correctly.
So I originally found out I was taking a lot of things for granted, didn't really know what I was talking about. And so I thought the rational response was to suspend belief and to gather more information and reevaluate at that time. So while I was gathering information, I said, not convinced. Once I thought I was at a place where I could revisit it, then I said, I am convinced, and it's that theism is not true. Ergo, that version of atheism, classical atheism, that's where I was at.
Okay. I just wanted to, and so you studying the historicity of the claims in the Gospels did eventually convince you that Christianity wasn't true, even though you don't like the theology. You're like, because of divine hiddenness. Am I correct? I just want to make sure I'm completely understanding you.
Yeah, so divine hiddenness is like a buzz phrase that most people know. I wouldn't necessarily call it that. I am convinced based on the historicity, but I would prefer that it not be true just because I don't like the fact that, I mean, I guess if I'm to be honest, I feel like I put a lot of effort into this and then, he doesn't have anything to say to me kind of thing. So it's kind of I don't know. I don't prefer that type of being. I would prefer one that would want to reach out in a way that I can recognize, not to get too deep or anything personal.
No, I would prefer that as well. I we're on the same page. And to be honest with you, I feel like I have good news. I feel like it's not true. I don't find the historicity of the accounts of the Gospels to be compelling myself. And I'm not saying that you find them compelling because of any sort of bias of wanting it to be true, but maybe in doing your research, you started to look for the things that confirmed it true. Like, I don't know what would motivate you to do such a thing if you're not wanting it to be true, if you're not feeling an emotional connection with this God. And I think there's a good reason why, just being completely blunt with you here. But in fairness to you, we haven't sat down and looked at a whole lot of information. This is a short phone call. So I do appreciate that you do look into things. It seems like you have a healthy amount of skepticism, and I would say keep using that.
Yeah, agreed. Everybody should have a skeptic muscle, let's say. Uh-oh, the host disconnected on call in studio, so